asked to talk about the history of carbon capture in about 10 minutes, 20 minutes, and I'll try my best to summarize things. And I would point at a slightly different angle from what you heard before. In many ways, we have to make decisions under large amounts of uncertainty and figure out where we go with all of this. And if I could summarize the history, first we had to figure out we had a problem. Then we had to find technical solutions. And now we are at the point where we have to figure out how to implement these solutions at very large scales, because that's what it will take. So as you just heard, we live in an overshoot world that still needs access to energy. And I think actually there's a moral obligation too. We can't leave poor countries out and tell them tough. We got rich, we had the energy, now you figure out how to make this work. We need to give access to energy for everybody. And that means we have to figure out a way of how to keep access to it. I would also argue today, carbon sequestration, this waste management problem you just heard about, is absolutely necessary. 30 years ago, it was optional, but we ignored the problem back then. And I would also say it is ultimately a carbon waste problem. It's not all climate change which comes from there. Other things contribute as well, but it is first and foremost a carbon problem. So I couldn't resist to get, if you want simple decisions, have simple guideposts, right? So here you see the Keeling curve, and I overlaid it with a ridiculously simple model. I said you have a roughly 2% annual growth, which I happen to anchor in this graph on the year 2000, and it came from 275. I needed to fudge a little to get it right. And you see this very nice fit of these data. You actually see that the actual annual fluctuation got a little larger over time, but it's a nearly perfect fit. And not that much I could tell you in 1990, because we already had data which showed that. And I think what you see is the crisis which is coming, that nothing much has changed. We have been talking, we haven't been doing much, but we are going to do about something, because if we didn't, this is how that curve progresses. I simply took the same model and I didn't stop it now at 2030. I kept it running to 2100. This is what you will see if we do business as usual. Clearly, we will not do that. It is one of those examples where you just run yourself in a contradiction, and we have to figure out how to solve this problem. So taking climate change seriously, in my view, means it leads to carbon capture and storage. We really don't have all that much choice. And it's first and foremost a carbon problem. You should think of it as a waste management problem. And I would take 40 gigatons a year. And sort of Peter and I actually agree, in the next few years, we are talking 20 gigatons. But let's face it, currently we emit 40 gigatons a year. If you think we grow 2% a year in energy consumption and squeeze it down by a factor of 5 in carbon intensity, we at the end of the century are again at 40 gigatons, because 2% growth for 80 years means 5-fold increase. And lastly, if you want to deal with 100 ppm of CO2, half of it is going to come back from the ocean. You are going to talk about roughly 40 gigatons a year for 40 years to solve this problem. So this is the scale we're dealing with. We need to figure out how to have a net zero carbon economy. And that in some ways needs sequestration technologies, carbon capture from the environment, and safe and permanent disposal of that carbon, right? And we ultimately need regulatory frameworks enforcing a zero carbon balance and a permanent carbon balance, where we are not leaving the problem for 5-6 generations later and let them figure out how to deal with what we just left for them. So we need rules based in quantitative carbon accounting. And I do think we need certification of carbon sequestration, whether this is in the infrastructure or whether it is as a waste disposal. It doesn't really matter from this perspective, but we have to agree that it has been done. So the first question is, if we actually have gigatons of carbon to deal with, where do we put it? I was interested in this already very early in the early 90s, and in 1995, we were probably the first ones who seriously looked at mineralization. In the IPCC report, I was part of the mineralization chapter in that effort of, I think, geological storage and ocean disposal are other options. I think what you're really looking for is permanence, and environmental safety issues need to be properly addressed. Of course, you think about cost, capacity, and safety. And I'm harping on the point that we are talking about permanence. And there's a lot of discussion, is it durability or permanence? I would say the washing machine, that's a durable good. That rock we would think of as permanent, but let's be honest, nothing on the billions of time year scale is really permanent. So when we mean permanence, we are talking on a relevant climate scale. I think 10,000 years is probably the right answer. We have to guarantee at the end that if we clean up, if we allow people to put carbon out, they better guarantee that they canceled it out on the 10,000 year time frame. That, I think, is an important ingredient in the overall story. And then, of course, it's great to have a place to put the carbon, but you also need to get your hands on it in the first place. So initially, I was very much interested in point source capture, but ultimately you realize that can only deal with half of it. So we really have no choice but to go after the other half and figure out how to make it happen. And now part of that other half nowadays is also the carbon we already emitted. There's no choice. I can't get it at the point source anymore because the point source doesn't exist anymore. So we have to get it either from the biocarbon or from the ocean or from the atmospheric carbon. My bet is on the atmospheric carbon because it's actually less dilute than in the ocean. The thermodynamics is equally favorable, and it has, unlike the biocide, it actually has a virtually unlimited capacity. But I do think all of these things have to come together, and we have to come up with testing whether a particular method is acceptable or not, and how do we deal with that. I would argue, ultimately, we have to scale up, and we have to scale up dramatically. And if you look at direct air capture, right now, it's honestly 10 times too expensive. Climeworks is saying we are at $1,000 a ton right now. They actually upped it rather than came down. And we argue you've got to figure out how to make that happen. And one of the things you notice if you mass produce, and this is one of the reasons I like mass production as a way of making lots of small things and mass manufacturing, there's a rule of thumb that things get roughly 20% cheaper if you double your cumulative output. If you build large things, your rough rule of thumb is maybe 10 or 12% reduction. And that is a huge, huge difference. And you can actually see how things might go forward. You start at a high price. You have a tiny little market because there's a willingness to pay among a small number of people. Now you saturated this market, but because you filled the market, you have improved output. So therefore, it's a little cheaper. So there's now a bigger market. You saturate this market, and you better get cheaper again. And if you just have a minimum demand rise as the price drops, you actually can run up that curve. And we argue there are two things to pay attention to. One is that learning rate, which we argue is particularly good if you're small and mass produced, and is not so good if you build nuclear power plants or equivalents to that. And on the other side, there is an irreducible cost. If you start with high energy consumption in your system, you have a high irreducible cost. If you have a low cost, you might be very expensive at the beginning. Keep in mind, these solar panels took 99 cents out of the dollar out of it by simply getting better, but there is a floor. And so we are saying there's this irreducible cost. And so what I'm drawing you here is various lines. Take the top line. I'm saying the learning rate is 10%. So think of big plant designs. And I'm running up the price curve. And by the time I reach $100 a ton, if I came up there and I had a $90 per ton irreducible cost, I'm bigger than the world demand of world emissions. I can't possibly get to that low price if this was my starting point. I could barely get there if I started at $30 a ton. It gets a little better, but 10% learning is actually not good enough. If you have 20% learning, on the other hand, and the $30 price, you need to roughly grow tenfold from where you're 1,000-fold from where you are right now to drop the price tenfold. Now, I would point out these learning rates, these irreducible costs are not very well understood. And these are phenomenological observations. People just have said this is roughly how it is. There are no guarantees in life on that. On the other hand, to ignore these observations is equally dangerous. So we are arguing go mass produced, go efficient, And you have a very fair chance that that $1,000, by the time you go from kilotons to megatons a year, could actually get into the $100 range. Once you are there, you are affordable. To put this in perspective, if you had to pay that on a barrel of oil or to make a new barrel of oil synthetically, $100 a ton is roughly $40 extra on a barrel. We have gone up and down by much more than that. So I do think we need to engineer for low R and high L and figure out how to get there. Because if we do, you can be optimistic that the technologies we have could do it. But now we need to generate demand, because if the demand is not there, then things simply stall out. So voluntary markets will help get us started. They can allow us to do things. And I would argue the things we have done with breakthrough energy and others are very, very important from that perspective. But ultimately, let's not kid ourselves. This is a regulatory market. This is a classic example of a market failure. There's a transaction between two people and nobody cares what happened to the climate. So we need to figure out how to make that work. But then the markets need quality assurance. We need to know that it's actually done and that it's done right. This is where we came to we need to have credible and accurate accounting, and we need to demand permanence, either by saying this is scientifically permanent, we know this is done and we don't have to do it again, or we have to have a mechanism where the storage operator is actually liable. And so if that comes out again, that storage operator has to buy a new certificate to make the old one whole. But in the end, for every ton of carbon coming out of the ground, a certificate that needs to be generated that an equal amount has been stored. And somebody will have to ensure that, right? Technology will not move forward without this. This is the catch-22 we are in right now. You either have demand or you don't have demand. And technologies nobody wants will never get better. And you see it in solar energy. They grew 1,000,000-fold and thereby drop cost 100-fold, which is exactly that 20% learning rate I just laid out, because it turns out that's a cube behavior. So we need to have certificates, and these certificates have to be backed up. Right? The backup means there has to be a guarantee that the storage is done correctly, and the liability of the storage operator has to be guaranteed. Because if this is a startup and says, maybe in 50 years from now I will pay that again, that's not going to work unless you have an insurance system behind it, which actually will do that. So you need to make that happen, and you have to have insurance companies which actually will insure the risk and make that happen. And that gets even worse. If you think about it for a moment, we cannot overnight get to the situation where we actually have this work. I would argue it's actually not all that expensive, I would point out. Because if you think about it, we have, if I have a 10% chance after 50 years I lost it, and I pay for this, and I go to Keimberg's and I say, I pay $1,000 a ton. And if I say I had a 10% risk and I discount at 5%, this is 0.77% of their cost I have to pay. Basically, the insurance is about $7.70. Put some profit on it, it's roughly $10 a ton I would have to pay to insure that, right? And air capture already puts a bound on that risk, because it says I can do it for $1,000 a ton. And so I think that actually could create a market all by itself. But the other problem you have is if we demand that things are taken care of right away, we can't possibly put all the carbon away overnight because we don't have the technology yet. So there will be futures on certificates. And insuring them becomes an even bigger issue, right? So we have to figure out how to do that and set up regulatory frameworks which say, if you put 1 ton really away, we allow you next year to have make a promise for one, and the year after another promise, and we do this for 50 years, and then we run out of promises, and now you have to do it for real, right? This would be a very novel insurance product, and insurance is half the way of actually paying for it. And it just hit me when I was writing these slides If I look at my life insurance, if I pay $100 a ton for my 15, that's a US average, 15 tons of carbon per year, I end up paying, if I lived 100 years, $150,000. My life insurance is larger than this. So we have actually outfits, institutions, which can collect money with a promise to pay in 50 years from now. And we know how to do this, and we could very well end up doing that. So we should demand immediate liability for carbon. I think the deal on the table should be, if you dig up carbon, you have to promise to put an equal amount away, not sometime in the future. The promise is now. And just like a bank loan, this will come due in the future. And the insurance manages large upfront money flows. So you may say this is complicated because there are major challenges to this insurance. The first one is there are large cash flows paying for future liabilities. They just pointed out that life insurance does this all the time. And there's an uncertainty in the advance of technologies. But this is balanced by climate liabilities. And I would say one more thing. Any other technology, any other approach to the problem, either hides that this is an issue or has to address it too. Because in reality, these two challenges are there regardless how you look at the problem. And it may be innovative and different, but we need innovative large-scale approaches. And we may have to jump in with both feet long before we know all the details. So we need to figure out how to do things fast. And you do have the slides, so you don't have to take a picture.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Klaus.